think about roguelite action games, most of them tend to fall into familiar molds. Top-down arenas, endless waves, maybe a few upgrades along the way before you eventually get overrun. But every now and then, a game comes along that tweaks the formula just enough to feel fresh, while still delivering the addictive, fast-paced loop fans of the genre are looking for. That's where 9th Sentinel Sisters comes in. This is a side-view, twin-stick roguelite set in a world that's already lost. Humanity isn't fighting for dominance anymore, it's fighting for scraps. Thousands of years after a mysterious meteorite crash-landed, its secret finally comes to light. It wasn't a rock at all, but the egg of a monstrous alien species. Out of that egg spill endless creatures called breeds, who quickly overwhelm the planet and wipe out entire nations. Civilization collapses, and the few survivors retreat underground into fortified shelters known as the Ark. That's the backdrop, and it's surprisingly weighty for a game that, on the surface, sells itself as a casual action roguelite. The lore adds a sense of desperation to what might otherwise just be another swarm shooter. To push back against extinction, humanity creates two last-ditch weapons. One is a massive manned combat machine known as Father. The other, cloned warriors who take the form of young girls, the Sisters, specially engineered to pilot Father into battle. It's a strange and striking choice for a protagonist. On one hand, they're symbols of fragility. On the other, they're humanity's only hope. Fighting in a desolate frontline base where survival is measured not in victories, but in temporary pushes against overwhelming odds. Now, that all sets the stage. But what does the actual gameplay feel like? At its core, 9th Sentinel Sisters gives you the joy of wiping out huge numbers of aliens with increasingly ridiculous weapons. We're talking lasers, drills, missile barrages, the kind of arsenal that's built for spectacle as much as survival. The difference is that it's presented from a side-view perspective, which instantly makes it stand apart from the sea of top-down roguelites out there. There's something satisfying about watching waves of enemies flood in from the edges of the screen, then carving through them with whatever combination of tools you've pieced together. And piecing things together is where the roguelite element really kicks in. Each run gives you access to 16 different weapon types and 37 reinforcement parts. That means you're not just blasting away, you're experimenting. Do you double down on raw damage and build a missile spam monster? Do you prioritize mobility and drills that let you push through hordes? Or maybe you want lasers that cut clean lines through anything unlucky enough to be in your way. The builds can swing from calculated strategies to pure chaos, and that unpredictability is what keeps people coming back for just one more run. But it's not only about the weapons. Each stage forces you to make choices about how to progress. Do you fight stronger enemies for the promise of greater rewards, or do you take the safer path and patch yourself up? Those little decisions add up, giving the game just enough strategy to balance the chaos. And because missions are designed to be short, you can play in bursts, perfect for players who don't always have time for an hour-long session but still want that hit of adrenaline. Of course, none of this would matter if the game didn't nail the feel of combat. That's always the litmus test with these kinds of games. Does moving, dodging, and firing feel satisfying enough to make you want to keep going even after a tough loss? From what's here, the answer is yes. The weapons feel impactful, and the twin-stick controls translate well to a side-view layout. It's one of those setups that might take a few minutes to get used to if you've been conditioned by top-down roguelites, but once it clicks, it feels smooth and responsive. Another strength is the variety in heroes. 9th Sentinel Sisters gives you 6 different characters to choose from, each bringing a slightly different flavor to the fight. That means when you do hit that point where you're comfortable with one sister's style, you can switch things up and challenge yourself with another. It keeps the game from getting stale and adds replay value beyond the usual roguelite loop. Thematically, the game leans hard into its post-apocalyptic atmosphere. The surface world is destroyed. Humanity has already lost the war, and every mission feels like a desperate push rather than a triumphant march. It's a setting that matches the gameplay perfectly. You're not here to single-handedly save the world in one run. You're here to push back the tide, experiment with builds, and enjoy the cathartic feeling of overwhelming firepower against endless enemies. If you've played other roguelites, you'll find some familiar DNA here. The quick missions, the incremental upgrades, the cycle of dying and returning stronger. But it's the combination of presentation, the unusual side-view twin-stick format, and the thematic framing that sets 9th Sentinel Sisters apart. It's not trying to reinvent the genre, but it is carving out its own space in it. At the end of the day, this is a game that doesn't ask you for hours of your time to feel rewarding. You can hop in, run a mission, experiment with a new build, and still walk away satisfied. That balance of accessibility and depth is what makes roguelites thrive, and 9th Sentinel Sisters seems to understand that better than most. So if you're looking for something that mixes fast-paced swarm combat with a bleak but intriguing sci-fi backdrop, and if you want the satisfaction of trying out weird and powerful weapon combos without overcomplicating things, this might just be worth your attention. It's not the kind of game that's going to blow up with mainstream hype, but for fans of the genre, it offers enough variety and style to carve out a place in the crowded roguelite landscape.